It's year-end interview time, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has been making the rounds. As today's Toronto Star's wrap of his 10 interviews points out, Poilievre revealed quite a few things about his plans should he become Prime Minister. From tying immigration levels to housing availability to a foreign policy he calls the Bring It Home Doctrine, the Friday Power Panel is here to dig through what we've learned. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. The Globe and Mail's Laura Stone is in Toronto, and here with me in studio, Susan Delacourt is the national columnist for the Toronto Star. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here on a Friday right before the holidays. Susan, I want to start with you because this is your colleague and, we should say, new Deputy Bureau Chief in the Parliament Hill Bureau, the fabulous Stephanie Lebitz. She did this great piece in the Star looking at what we learned. What stood out to you the most?
First, I should say she had that title before she agreed to listen to 10 interviews. She's amazing. I don't know how she does it, but she listened to them all. The things that stood out for me, some of the fun stuff, of course. I like those year-end interviews that have the fun bits in them. So I like the pronunciation of his name.
Poilievre, I believe.
Poilievre. Yes.
Okay.
But he says he's fine with Poilievre.
Yeah.
The moose milk recipe, of course.
Which is a Bailey's alternative, apparently.
Yeah.
But some serious policy stuff in here, too.
Exactly, yeah, I'm not going to
start reading the recipe on air.
No. Yeah, I was intrigued with the immigration stuff, Bring It Home. Mm-hmm. That sounds kind of Canada First, or I'm sure what the Liberals are going to turn it into is Make Canada Great Again, something like that.
Well, we already hear the Prime Minister talking about this idea of MAGA conservatives.
That's right.
He said
yeah. I think we'll get to his interviews too, but I was intrigued by what he said to Rosie Barton on that score. But the intriguing thing to me is that Poilievre has not been speaking about foreign policy. It's very hard to get him speaking about it. And so kudos to the interviewers who actually dragged him out a bit on that too. He actually had some interesting things to say about the Middle East even. That right now what's going on is not pro-Palestinian, it's pro-Hamas. I think he should do more of these interviews, say with maybe the CBC or the Toronto Star.
I will just say, I'm sure you folks have been politely asking. The show I usually host, The House, asking a lot, and we look forward to the opportunity. I do want to maybe outline a little bit, Susan, in terms of the Bring It Home Doctrine and what we learned from the conversations that he had. He says it means bringing home our money rather than giving it away in foreign aid to terrorists and dictatorships and international bureaucracies. It means defending our energy sector on the world stage, and at one point talks about how the money could go to the military, Canadian military instead.
Yeah, I think, that I want to see him explain exactly how that works, too, because it's not like any government has a policy of giving money to dictators. So I think he's talking about the oil, about capitalizing more on the fact that we should be providing Europe with its oil needs rather than Russia, et cetera. But he's been saying that for a while. I'm intrigued to see the details of this. So that when the Star gets its interview, we'll ask him some more.
Okay. Nigan, I want to go over to you, and either things that stood out for you or questions that some of this might have inspired for you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the good. I mean, these interviews are meant to humanize. They're meant to do the same things that he's been trying to do, which is image makeover over the past 6 to 8 months, taking off the glasses, showing up in a much more softer side, stopping using words like Canada's broken. So, I mean, we saw more of that in these interviews, but there was some intriguing little nuggets here and there. I mean, he is talking about trying to make Canada a leader on the energy sector, saying things like there's 60 to 100 million barrels of oil that's going to be needed, and do we want that in dirty Saudi Arabia versus clean Canada, and using those kinds of I'm scared to say whistleblower terms, but I mean, Poilievre, if anything, is really very adept, and even the Prime Minister recognized this in his year interviews, is taking a tiny thing that Canadians are concerned about or have a kind of wondering about, and then making it a big stoplight issue that people sort of pick upon, really stick on, and then he makes usually fun phrases or rhymes out of it. That's something that he's very good at. And one thing that he is really good at is taking these kinds of moments with the media and then being able to create these tiny clips out of it. I mean, we all know about the apple biting clip that now has 700,000 views on YouTube. He's very adept at that, and I don't think it's any coincidence that he visited with the medias that's very friendly to him, and then immediately today released a video about defunding the CBC and saving $1 billion as a result. So he's able to pick up on those tiny things very quickly and be able to move very quickly. But I think the one thing that I thought was very interesting out of the entire interview was his focus on parental rights. I mean, he is right that Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick was first criticized for parental rights, but now he's seeing some movement. Blaine Higgs is actually campaigning on that. So I think he's seeing that there is kind of a movement within the country to pick up on certain conservative issues, and he's really harping and focusing on that and saying, hey, I've supported that too.
Yeah, and we should say the parental rights, this is in regards to the pronouns that students use in the classroom. We know New Brunswick and Saskatchewan have passed new policies on that. I did think it was interesting. As far as I can tell, Mr. Poilievre wasn't asked where he stands on the resolution his party passed in the fall, which was banning surgery and medical procedures for trans kids. At the time, he wouldn't say where he stands. He's had some time to think about it. Will we hear an answer to that? Laura, I was also particularly interested in the question of immigration levels. True North's Andrew Lawton he tried to get a straight answer from Mr. Poilievre about whether or not the Liberal targets were, in Mr. Poilievre's view, too high. And Mr. Poilievre was quite clear that he wasn't going to specifically answer that question, but he did give a sort of bigger picture look at how he's viewing this issue, saying tight housing, you tie it to the number of doctors and nurses, job availability. What did you make of that?
I think it was really interesting that came out at the same time that the Prime Minister this week was asked about immigration levels at a housing announcement. And he talked about, needing to kind of rein in students. He talked about asylum seekers and problems with people crossing, which I think was, very different than the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, we may have heard 4 or 5 years ago. He talked about temporary foreign workers. So I think that that's a sign, I guess, that both of the Liberals and the Conservatives are seeing that this issue of immigration, while approaching it, maybe the Liberals are taking more of a softer approach to this, but I think they're seeing probably concerns from the electorate about housing and immigration and how that's tied. Mr. Poilievre was not forthcoming when asked what his targets would be. As you mentioned, Andrew Lawton from True North did try to pin him down on that. I think there was a lot of these interviews which were given to primarily conservative leading media or, quote unquote, friendly media, not, those mainstream media outlets that Pierre Poilievre has clashed with throughout the year. There was a lot of wait to see my platform. And, in 2025, we'll talk about the platform. So I think he's approaching this from the stance of a front runner. Obviously, the polls have put Pierre Poilievre ahead of the Liberals throughout the year. He's talking to people who maybe agree with him or see his viewpoint, who maybe don't challenge him in the same way that some of the other outlets would. And I'm not saying that some of the interviewers didn't do a good job, but clearly he's not talking to the more mainstream outlets that three of us represent. And so he's doing this as, maybe a way to avoid some accountability and some of those difficult questions to try to pin him down.
I will say, and I don't want to spend too much time sort of having the media talk about the media, but he did talk to the Toronto Sun and private radio stations, which many of whom might consider themselves mainstream media, but I think we want to keep the focus on the policy issues here. And Susan, I do want to pick up on that immigration issue for 1 second, because I think it's really interesting to look at how this issue both works for and against both the Liberals and the Conservatives. Like Mr. Poilievre, I mean, I watched him from the beginning of his leadership campaign. He has taken great pains to speak very positively about immigration. He makes the point that his own wife came to Canada and, talks about needing to get credentials faster for foreign-trained doctors and nurses. As there is this conversation that the Liberals are really pushing around him being MAGA-like, he has really gone to great lengths to not seem anti-immigration.
And that is the huge distinction between the Canadian Conservative movement and the American one. That Donald Trump, the Liberals like to compare Poilievre to Trump, but I remember an interview that Stephen Harper gave way back in the day when Jason Kenney was doing a great job at recruiting cultural communities to the Conservative cause, and saying that he was proud of the fact that, unlike other conservative movements around the world, they weren't anti-immigration, the conservatives. So I think Poilievre is very mindful of that. So watching him walk that balance in these interviews, saying, and not fall into the anti-immigration thing is...
I do want to ask you, Susan, and then I'll ask the rest of the panel quickly before we go. You mentioned the Prime Minister's year-end interview, and one of the interesting things that he said in his conversation with the CBC was his suggestion that, like, well, Mr. Poilievre can say whatever he wants. We have to make choices. Mr. Poilievre is the leader of the opposition and not in government. It's, to me, a fascinating question how much an opposition party, and particularly one that is poised in the polls to take power, ought to say about what its plans are, what is reasonable to ask of them.
Good question.
What are your thoughts about it?
Responsibly, they do have to. And I will say that, I covered Justin Trudeau in the months leading up and years leading up to him becoming Prime Minister, and he did lay out. I went to a speech where he did, Canada-U.S. policy.
I think I was there too, back in the day.
The child tax credit, that was also unveiled. So I don't think that Pierre Poilievre, there are people who say he's just going to try to coast into victory by saying nothing, kind of like Doug Ford did. I remember Doug Ford didn't put out a platform.
But I also think they're very different politicians, like Poilievre.
Very different, yes.
A bit more of a wonk. And those Trudeau speeches, I will say, were a bit closer to election time, so the timing is key.
Yeah.
I think we've only got a couple minutes left, and I'd like to get a last word in from Nigan and Laura. So Nigan, I'll start with you. Whether you want to weigh in on that question of how much a politician ought to reveal when they're not in power about their plans, or if you just want to talk about the questions you have.
No, well, this is the central core of when you saw today Liberals coming out speaking about the year-end interviews that Poilievre was giving. I mean, that's a bit of an anomaly to have a governing party talk about the opposition party's year-end interviews. But that alone, Poilievre is a master at just saying just enough to say that he said something, but really to say nothing. I mean, what is his general issue around climate change? It's just, we got to improve everything. And
axe the tax, green technology.
Just approve, and we got to turn everything green. And whatever Trudeau does is terrible and is worse. And, so you can say, oh, well, I did talk about this, but you didn't really say anything about this. And, of course, the number one issue that I always get into when I see this approve is really just a way of demonizing those who would then say, hey, we should consult. That's Indigenous peoples. That's talking about First Nations rights. The one thing that, is very interesting in his moves here on these speeches is the way that he appealed to the NDP voters. He really demonized Jagmeet Singh and saying that, hey, the unions are not happy with the NDP.
Okay, I think we are right out of time here. I'm sorry, Laura. We'll just wish you happy holidays with your beautiful
no problem.
Stalking background there. Thank you so much to all the members of the Power Panel. Lovely to have all of you on this almost holiday Friday. Nigan Sinclair, Susan Delacourt, and Laura Stone.